Everyone thought the bear would attack the man after being rescued, but what it did was shocking. The dense Canadian wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast sea of towering evergreens and snow-laden pines. John Carter, a seasoned park ranger, navigated the familiar terrain with steady steps, his breath visible in the crisp winter air. The weight of his pack rested comfortably on his back, and his gloved hands gripped the straps tightly as he trudged forward, his boots crunching against the frost-bitten ground. The day had started like any other. An early morning patrol, checking for signs of illegal hunting or lost hikers. The sun was a pale glow behind the clouds, casting long shadows that flickered between the trees. He had walked these paths countless times before, but something in the air today felt off. The usual stillness of the forest was disturbed, the silence holding an edge of tension, as if the land itself was waiting, bracing for something unseen. John had learned to trust his instincts. Years of patrolling had trained his senses to pick up on the smallest disturbances, the faintest changes in the air, the quiet warnings nature whispered to those who listened. And right now, every fiber of his being was on alert. He paused, pulling his radio from his belt, debating whether to check in with the station. Before he could press the button, a sound cut through the trees, a deep, guttural growl followed by a sharp, pained grunt. His blood ran cold. That was no ordinary wildlife noise. That was suffering. John's muscles tensed as he turned toward the source, his heartbeat quickening. He moved cautiously, stepping lightly to avoid snapping twigs beneath his boots. The sound came again, ragged, desperate, a wounded animal. His first thought was a deer caught in a snare. Poachers had been active in the area despite stricter patrols, and it wouldn't be the first time he had found one of their cruel traps. Jaw clenched, he pressed forward, weaving between the thick pines until the trees opened into a small clearing. And then he saw it. A massive bear lay sprawled in the snow, its hulking form trembling with exhaustion and pain. Its thick fur, a deep shade of brown, was streaked with blood, staining the pristine white beneath it. John's breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted to the cruel metal snares coiled around its limbs, tight, rusted loops digging deep into flesh, cutting through fur, turning the snow beneath them a sickening crimson. 3 separate traps, each positioned to ensure agony. The bear's chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven breaths, its eyes flickering with the haze of pain. John knew that kind of suffering. He had seen it in animals left too long in the grip of steel, their will broken before their bodies followed. For a moment, he stood frozen. Every survival instinct screamed at him to turn back. This was a full-grown grizzly, a predator powerful enough to crush a man's skull with a single swipe. Injured or not, it was dangerous. But then the bear let out another low, exhausted groan, its massive body barely shifting as it failed to move. And something deep inside John shattered. He took a slow step forward, hands raised instinctively, his voice barely above a whisper. "Easy, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you." The bear's ears twitched at the sound, its dark eyes locking onto him. There was no aggression in them, only raw, unfiltered pain. John had seen fear in animals before, but this was something else. Resignation, as if it knew it was dying and had already accepted its fate. His chest tightened as he took another step, scanning the traps with a practiced eye. The first one, looped around the bear's front leg, was a heavy-duty snare designed for large prey, its coiled wire biting deep into the thick muscle. The second was wrapped around its hind leg, restricting movement. The third, John's stomach twisted, was the worst. A brutal jaw trap clamped over the bear's other front paw, its serrated edges buried into flesh, the rusted metal soaked in fresh blood. A slow exhale left John's lips. This was bad. He needed to move fast. Dropping his pack carefully, he reached inside, pulling out a set of heavy-duty wire cutters and a length of rope. He had handled trapped animals before, but never anything this massive, this unpredictable. The bear watched him, its breath shallow, its strength nearly gone. If it had the energy to lash out, this would be impossible. But it didn't. It only lay there, its powerful frame betrayed by exhaustion. Kneeling beside its massive front leg, John positioned the cutters over the first snare, pressing down firmly. The wire snapped with a sharp twang, loosening its hold. The bear flinched but did not move further, only letting out a deep exhale, steam curling from its nostrils. One down. He worked quickly, moving to the hind leg, his heart hammering in his chest. This trap was older, rusted, and he had to strain to break it. Finally, with a grunt of effort, the wire gave way, springing open with a jolt. The bear stirred slightly, but again, it did not attack. It was too weak, too drained. Now came the real challenge, the jaw trap. John's fingers shook as he adjusted his grip on the tool. This was the one that could send the bear into a frenzy. His pulse roared in his ears as he positioned the cutters at the thickest point, applying pressure. The metal resisted, but he pressed harder, sweat forming beneath his collar despite the cold. Then with a sharp snap, the jaws loosened. The bear let out a deep, guttural groan, its massive body jerking slightly before going still. John sat back, his breath coming in short gasps. The job was done. The bear was free, but the damage had been done. Deep wounds, exposed muscle, and the undeniable signs of infection. If left alone, it wouldn't survive. He should leave. He had done what he could. But as he met the bear's gaze once more, something unspoken passed between them. A silent plea, a flicker of trust. John reached for his radio. "Base, this is Carter. I have an emergency." His voice was steady, unwavering. He glanced at the bear again, watching its massive form rise and fall with each slow breath. "I need a wildlife rescue team out here. We've got a wounded bear, and I'm not leaving it." John sat back on his heels, the cold seeping through his pants as he studied the bear before him. It remained still, its massive body rising and falling in slow, labored breaths, the pain evident in every shudder. The open wounds where the traps had dug into its flesh bled sluggishly, and John knew infection had already begun to set in. His grip tightened on the radio. The static crackled in response. Then a voice broke through. Greg, his supervisor at the station. "John!" "Say again. Did you say a wounded bear?" John exhaled sharply, keeping his eyes locked on the animal. "Yeah, big one. Been caught in multiple traps. I freed it, but it's in rough shape. If we don't get help soon, it won't make it." The radio was silent for a moment. Then Greg's voice returned, lower, more serious. "Damn poachers. We'll send the wildlife team your way. Hang tight." John clipped the radio back to his belt, his breath fogging in the crisp air. Hang tight. Easy to say. Not so easy when you were sitting mere feet from a bear that could wake up at any moment and decide you were the enemy. But the longer he looked at it, the less fear he felt. The bear's eyes remained half-lidded, dark and glassy, its strength all but gone. Something about it tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He moved slowly, reaching into his pack again. First, bandages. He wasn't a vet, but he had basic first aid supplies, and it was better than nothing. He tore strips of gauze and wrapped them carefully around the worst wounds, working swiftly but cautiously. The bear flinched only once, letting out a low rumble that sent a ripple of tension through John's body. He froze, hands hovering, but the bear didn't lash out. Instead, it simply let out a long, exhausted sigh, its muscles relaxing once more. The trust was fragile, but it was there. Minutes stretched into an hour. The forest was eerily silent, the usual distant calls of birds and rustling of small creatures absent, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. John shifted, rubbing his hands together for warmth, his fingers stiff from the cold. He had expected the rescue team by now, but the deep woods made radio signals unreliable, and he had no way of knowing how far out they were. He glanced back at the bear. It was watching him now, not in a predatory way, but in a way that felt almost aware, as if it was trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand it. John had spent years studying the animals of this forest. He had witnessed a mother moose defend her calf against a pack of wolves, seen fox kits playing in the underbrush, watched eagles soar high above the treetops. But never had he been this close to something so powerful, so wild, and yet so vulnerable at the same time. His fingers twitched toward his radio again. Maybe he should call Greg for an update. But just as he reached for it, the bear let out a sudden, deep growl. Not of aggression, but of something else. Pain. It tried to move, its muscles tensing as it attempted to shift its weight. Its injured leg buckled beneath it, and it let out a sharp grunt of pain before collapsing back into the snow. John instinctively reached out, then caught himself. What was he going to do? Hold it up? As if he could. Still, the sight of it struggling sent a pang through his chest. The bear was trying to survive. It just couldn't. Not like this. His mind raced. If the rescue team didn't arrive soon, the bear wouldn't last much longer. Hypothermia was a risk, even for an animal of its size, especially with blood loss and shock setting in. He needed to do something. Anything. Then an idea struck him, reckless and half-formed. It wasn't like he had any better options. Moving carefully, he reached for his pack once more, this time pulling out a thick emergency blanket. It wasn't much, but it could help keep in some warmth. He hesitated, then took a deep breath and stepped closer. The bear tensed slightly, but it didn't growl this time. It just watched him, its eyes following his every movement. Slowly, he draped the blanket over its massive back, adjusting it as best as he could around its injured limbs. He knew it wouldn't stay for long. If the bear decided to shake it off, there was nothing he could do about it. But for now, it lay still, accepting the strange offering without protest. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You're gonna make it," he muttered, not entirely sure if he was saying it for the bear's sake or his own. Time dragged on. The cold seeped into his bones and his fingers had gone numb despite his gloves. He checked his watch. 2 hours since he had called it in. He clenched his jaw. Where the hell were they? He was about to try the radio again when the bear let out a sudden, low huff, shifting slightly beneath the blanket. John frowned, watching as its nose twitched, its dark eyes scanning the trees behind him. It was sensing something. Then John heard it too. Footsteps, heavy ones. His pulse jumped as he turned, half expecting to see another bear emerging from the trees. But instead, a figure in a thick winter coat stepped through the underbrush, a rifle slung over one shoulder. Relief flooded John's chest. "About damn time," he called out. The man lifted a hand in greeting, then stepped closer, his sharp eyes landing on the wounded bear. "Jesus," he muttered, crouching beside John. "This is worse than I thought." John nodded. "It's bad. How far out is the team?" 10 minutes, maybe less." The man, a wildlife specialist named Mark, reached into his own pack, pulling out a sedative syringe. "We'll need to tranquilize it before we move it." John exhaled sharply, his shoulders finally loosening. Help had arrived. The bear's breathing remained slow but steady, its eyes flickering as if it understood that something was happening, something different from the pain it had known before. As Mark prepared the tranquilizer, John reached out one last time, pressing his palm lightly against the thick fur just above its shoulder. The bear didn't flinch. It didn't pull away. It just let him. A connection. A moment. Then the syringe slid in, and the world blurred as the forest once again fell into silence, waiting. The sound of the helicopter's blades cut through the crisp morning air, sending ripples through the tree line as John stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the rescue team work with quiet urgency. The bear lay sedated on a reinforced transport stretcher, its massive frame carefully secured with thick straps to prevent further injury. Blood still matted its fur, a stark contrast against the silver-gray tarp they had draped over it to keep it warm. John exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease even as Mark and the other wildlife specialists moved with practiced efficiency. The sedative had worked quickly, lulling the bear into a deep but temporary sleep. But John knew the hardest part was still ahead. A rescue was one thing, survival was another. He shifted his weight, adjusting the strap of his pack as Mark approached. The older man wiped his forehead with the back of a gloved hand, his expression unreadable beneath the thick fabric of his coat. "It's stable for now, but it's lost a lot of blood," he said grimly. "If we'd been any later." He let the sentence hang, unfinished, because they both knew how it would have ended. John nodded, glancing back at the bear. Despite everything, despite the pain, the fear, the suffering, It had held on, fought to survive, and for some reason that thought unsettled him more than it reassured him. "We'll airlift it to the Wildlife Center," Mark continued, pulling John's focus back to the present. "There's a team on standby. They'll do what they can, but no guarantees." His words were pragmatic, spoken from years of experience, but John could hear the weight in them. There was always a chance that no matter what they did, the bear wouldn't make it. The damage could be too severe, the infection too deep. He clenched his jaw, pushing the thought away. "I want to go with it," he said, surprising even himself with the certainty in his voice. Mark studied him for a beat before nodding. "Figured you'd say that. Hop in." The next few minutes were a blur of movement. The helicopter's back hatch opened, the stretcher was secured inside, and John climbed in after it, gripping the overhead rail as the pilot signaled for takeoff. The ground fell away beneath them, the endless stretch of forest shrinking as they ascended into the open sky. John kept his gaze on the bear, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of its massive chest. It was still breathing, still here. That was all that mattered for now. The flight was turbulent, pockets of wind shaking the aircraft as they soared over the landscape. But John barely noticed. His mind was a tangled mess of thoughts, running in loops he couldn't seem to break. He had encountered injured animals before, rescued more than he could count. But this was different. This wasn't just a wounded creature in need of aid. There was something else at play, something unspoken in the way the bear had looked at him, the way it had allowed him to help, to touch it, to stand so close without a trace of fear. A wild animal should have seen him as a threat, yet somehow it hadn't. The helicopter landed smoothly on the rooftop helipad of the Wildlife Center, and within seconds the team was in motion. John jumped down, following as the stretcher was wheeled through the facility, past sterile white walls and into a large medical bay designed for treating large animals. The head veterinarian, Dr. Elaine Porter, was already waiting, her team prepped and ready. "Vitals?" she called as they maneuvered the bear onto the examination table. "Stable but weak," Mark answered, unclipping the straps. "Severe lacerations from multiple traps, significant blood loss, possible infection." John stepped back, watching as Elaine ran practiced hands over the bear's body, checking wounds, assessing damage. The room buzzed with activity, machines beeping, voices exchanging rapid instructions, gloved hands working quickly to clean and dress injuries. John's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had done what he could, but it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. "John," Elaine's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was looking at him now, her sharp eyes softened by something unreadable. "You did good bringing it in when you did. This bear has a chance because of you." He swallowed hard, nodding once. But a chance wasn't a promise. A chance wasn't a guarantee. And as he stood there, feeling the weight of it all settle in his chest, he realized just how much he wanted this animal to live. Hours passed. John paced the waiting area, his nerves frayed from too much coffee and not enough answers. Mark had left to file his report, and the rest of the rescue team had moved on to their next assignment. But John remained. He couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he knew. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly, the rhythmic sound drilling into his skull. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor as exhaustion crept in. He didn't even realize he had drifted off until a voice shook him awake. "John." His head snapped up, blinking the sleep from his eyes as Elaine stood in front of him. Her face was unreadable, but there was no urgency in her posture, no grief weighing down her expression. That had to be a good sign. "It pulled through the surgery," she said, and John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We managed to stop the bleeding and clean out the wounds. The infection was bad, but we're hitting it with everything we've got. It's not out of the woods yet, but..." She offered a small, tired smile. "It's strong." John let out a slow breath, leaning back against the chair as the tension finally loosened in his chest. "Yeah," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It is." Elaine sat beside him, crossing her arms. "You should go home, get some rest." He shook his head. "I want to stay, at least until it wakes up." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, but try not to wear a hole in the floor while you wait." John huffed a quiet laugh, but the moment was short-lived. His thoughts were already drifting back to the bear, to the way it had looked at him, as if recognizing him in a way no wild animal should. He didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe in things happening for a reason. But something about this didn't feel like an accident. And as he sat there waiting for the bear to wake, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The low hum of medical machines filled the quiet room, their rhythmic beeping marking the steady, unbroken pulse of life. John sat in the corner, arms crossed, eyes locked on the massive form stretched out on the reinforced examination table. The bear's chest rose and fell in deep, slow breaths, the heavy sedation keeping it in a state of deep, healing sleep. The deep gashes along its legs had been stitched with expert precision, thick bandages wrapping the worst of the wounds. An IV line trailed from its foreleg, delivering fluids and antibiotics, a necessary fight against the infection that had already begun creeping through its bloodstream. The air in the room was thick with the scent of antiseptics and fur, the sterile chill of the clinic pressing against John's skin. But he didn't move. He had been here for hours, watching, waiting. Elaine had checked on him once or twice, each time telling him the same thing. He needed rest, needed to eat, needed to step outside for fresh air. But he had ignored every piece of advice she had given. He wasn't leaving, not yet, not until he saw it open its eyes. He shifted slightly in his chair, rubbing his hands together for warmth, exhaustion weighing heavy in his bones. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear trapped in the snow, its eyes dull with suffering, the steel biting deep into its flesh. He saw the slow, pained trust in the way it had let him near, the way it hadn't fought him even when it had every reason to. Something about it wouldn't let him go. A deep, low breath rumbled from the table, breaking through the quiet. John straightened instantly, his pulse jumping as he watched the bear's massive frame shift slightly beneath the thin hospital blanket. The slow, measured rise and fall of its ribs changed, quickening, each breath growing sharper. Its ears twitched. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, its eyelids fluttered open. John didn't move, barely dared to breathe as those dark eyes focused, adjusting to the dim light, blinking away the fog of sedation. It lay still for a moment, disoriented, processing, its instincts likely screaming that something was wrong, that this wasn't the wilderness, that the air smelled too clean, too unnatural. The bear's nostrils flared, taking in its surroundings, and then its head moved slightly, shifting its gaze. Its eyes locked onto John. A shiver ran through him, not from fear but from something deeper, something unexplainable. He had spent his life surrounded by wildlife, had studied animals long enough to understand their behaviors, their patterns. But this was different. The way it looked at him wasn't the way an animal looked at a stranger, nor was it the way a wounded creature regarded a rescuer with blind gratitude. No, it was something else. Something ancient, something knowing. It wasn't afraid, it wasn't aggressive, it was aware. John let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay relaxed, to keep his movements calm. "Hey there, big guy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, the same way he had spoken to it in the forest. The bear didn't react immediately, just kept staring at him, blinking slowly, as if it were trying to remember. Finally, it let out a low, rough exhale, shifting slightly, testing the weight of its own limbs. When it moved its front paw, the pain must have flared through its body, because it let out a deep, guttural groan, its jaw tightening, its muscles tensing. John leaned forward instinctively, every part of him wanting to help, but there was nothing he could do beyond what had already been done. Elaine's voice broke the silence. "Easy now," she said gently as she stepped into the room, clipboard in hand. "You've been through a lot." The bear's head turned toward her briefly before its gaze flickered back to John, its breath still heavy but controlled. Elaine glanced at John, then back at the bear, her expression unreadable. "It recognizes you," she said after a moment, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. John didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to. Elaine sighed, stepping closer to check the IV, monitoring the sedation levels. "It'll take time, but the wound should heal," she said, her tone shifting into a more clinical, professional one. "We got to the infection early, so there's a good chance it won't spread. The real challenge will be rehab. A bear this size needs full mobility to survive in the wild, and with the muscle damage from those traps, it's going to be a long recovery." John nodded absently, still watching the bear, still feeling that unshakable weight in his chest. "What happens after?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Elaine gave him a look, one he couldn't quite read. "If it heals properly, we release it back into the wild," she said simply. "If not," she trailed off, not needing to finish. "If it couldn't fend for itself, if the damage was too great, the bear would have to live out its life in a sanctuary, confined to a protected area, never truly free again." John swallowed hard, nodding again. The bear let out another slow breath, its body relaxing slightly, as if exhaustion had overtaken it once more. It didn't fight against the fourth, didn't try to move beyond what its injuries allowed. It simply watched John. Then, as if deciding something in that massive, wild mind of its, it closed its eyes again and let sleep take it. Elaine sighed, setting her clipboard down. "You should go home," she told John again, softer this time, almost understanding. "You've done your part." But had he? He wasn't sure. Something inside him still felt unfinished, still felt like there was more to this than just a rescue, than just a wounded animal and a ranger who happened to be in the right place at the right time. He wasn't ready to walk away. He glanced at Elaine and shook his head. "I'll stay a little longer." She didn't argue this time, only gave a small nod before stepping out, leaving him alone once more with the sleeping bear. The machines beeped steadily in the quiet, the scent of antiseptic lingering in the air, but John hardly noticed. His mind was too tangled, too caught in something he couldn't quite name. He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the slow, steady rhythm of the bear's breathing. It should have been afraid of him. It should have fought him. It should have seen him as just another human, another creature to fear, to avoid. But it hadn't. It had let him help, let him touch it, let him stand in its space without a single sign of distrust. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him the most. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows of the wildlife clinic, casting pale streaks across the polished floors as John sat in the observation room, his eyes fixed on the bear's slow, steady breathing. It had been 3 days since the surgery, 3 days of careful monitoring, of quiet, tense hours spent watching for any sign of deterioration. But the bear was still here, alive, healing. John should have felt relief, but instead, a strange unease settled in his chest, an unshakable weight that had followed him since the moment their paths had crossed in the forest. The bear's gaze, that piercing, knowing stare, had been burned into his thoughts, lingering in the quiet spaces of his mind like an unanswered question. Elaine walked in, her boots clicking softly against the tile. She glanced at John, then at the bear, arms crossed over her clipboard. "You're still here," she said, her tone hovering somewhere between curiosity and amusement. John didn't look away from the massive creature on the medical platform, its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was far too steady for an animal that should have died out there. "Honey, yeah," he said simply. Elaine sighed, shaking her head as she moved toward the monitors, scanning the bear's vitals. "You know, I've seen a lot of people come through here over the years. Rescuers, rangers, wildlife experts. They all care, but they also know when to step back." She glanced at him. "This isn't like you." John exhaled, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense anyway. "It's different this time," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know why, but it is." Elaine didn't press, just nodded in that way she did when she was filing something away to think about later. Instead, she turned her attention back to the bear, scanning the bandages, the slow twitch of its ears, the slight shifting of its paws as it stirred from sleep. "It's recovering faster than I expected," she said after a moment. "Even with the muscle damage, it's strong. If it keeps this up, we might be able to move it to the outdoor enclosure sooner rather than later." John nodded absently, but his mind was already moving elsewhere. He thought about the poachers, about the traps that had nearly torn this animal apart. Someone had set them. Someone had planned for an animal like this to suffer, and that someone was still out there. His jaw tightened. "Have you heard anything from the investigation?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Elaine shook her head. "Greg's been looking into it, says they found a few more traps in the same area, but no leads yet." She shot him a look. "You thinking of getting involved?" John didn't answer right away. Technically, it wasn't his job to track down poachers. That was law enforcement's responsibility, but he couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't random. He had worked these forests long enough to know the difference between an opportunistic trap and a deliberate setup. And this had been meant for something big. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "I just want to make sure it doesn't happen again," he said finally. Elaine studied him for a long moment before exhaling, shaking her head. "Just be careful," she muttered. "You already have enough on your plate." John didn't argue. He knew she was right, but that didn't change the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind, the quiet certainty that this wasn't over. The bear let out a deep, slow breath, its body shifting slightly, the first real movement it had made since waking. John straightened instinctively, his focus narrowing as he watched its thick paws flex against the platform. Then slowly its head lifted, its dark eyes blinking open. John held still, his breath caught somewhere in his throat. The bear looked at him, and this time, there was no haze of sedation clouding its gaze. The moment stretched, long and unbroken, as something passed between them, something John couldn't name, couldn't explain. The bear's breathing was even, its expression calm, unthreatening. If anything, it was studying him as much as he was studying it. And then after a long pause, it did something that sent a shiver down John's spine. It blinked, slow and deliberate. Then it huffed, the sound low and almost familiar. John didn't move, didn't speak, didn't dare break the moment. His pulse thrummed in his ears, his mind racing through every logical explanation for what he had just seen, what he had just felt. Because that, whatever it was, hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been instinct. It had been recognition. Elaine's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clinical. "It's responding well," she noted, scribbling something onto her clipboard. "That's a good sign." John barely heard her. His hands felt cold, his stomach tight with something between unease and awe. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice distant. "A good sign." But deep down, he knew it was something more. Something he wasn't ready to understand yet. The morning mist clung to the towering evergreens as John stood at the edge of the Wildlife Reserve's enclosure, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. Beyond the reinforced steel fencing, the bear moved slowly, each step deliberate as it tested its strength, its massive form casting long shadows against the damp earth. Weeks of care had brought it back from the brink, its once ravaged limbs now steady, its fur regaining its thick, untamed luster. The bandages were gone, leaving behind only scars, faint reminders of the cruelty it had endured. But despite everything, it was alive. It was whole, and now it was ready to go home. John's fingers curled around the straps of his pack as he watched the bear move, its dark eyes surveying the enclosure, ears flicking at every distant sound. It had been more than a month since the rescue, and in that time, something unspoken had formed between them. A quiet understanding, a fragile connection that John couldn't explain, but also couldn't ignore. He had spent too many days watching over it, speaking in quiet murmurs when no one else was around, studying the way it looked at him with something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite trust. It was something else, something deeper. Elaine stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "It's strong enough now," she said after a moment, her voice careful, measured. "We can take it back to the forest today." John nodded, his gaze never leaving the bear. "Yeah," he murmured, "it's time." The release site had already been chosen, a remote stretch of protected land deep within the reserve, far from roads, far from hunters, far from the hands that had once sought to tear it apart. The transport crate was ready, reinforced but open to allow it to step in willingly rather than be forced. They wouldn't sedate it this time. It needed to walk into its own freedom. The bear lifted its head, sniffing the air as if sensing what was coming. John felt a strange tightness in his chest as he watched it take a final, slow step forward, its powerful muscles rippling beneath thick fur. It had survived wounds that should have killed it. It had endured pain most creatures wouldn't have recovered from. And yet here it stood, breathing, moving, watching him. Mark and a few other wildlife specialists moved carefully, guiding it toward the transport crate with practiced ease. It hesitated only briefly before stepping inside, the heavy gate closing behind it with a muted click. There was no panic, no struggle, just acceptance. The drive to the release site was silent. John sat in the back of the truck, the metal of the transport crate humming faintly with every turn of the road. The bear didn't make a sound, but he knew it was awake, knew it was aware. Every so often he could feel the weight of its gaze on him, though he never turned to meet it. He didn't need to. When they arrived, the forest was alive with the distant calls of ravens and the soft rustling of wind through the branches. The scent of damp earth filled the air, mingling with the sharpness of pine and the fading chill of morning frost. It was the kind of wilderness untouched by human hands, where the balance of nature remained intact. It was where the bear belonged. The team worked quickly, securing the transport crate in place before stepping back. John moved forward without thinking, his hands steady as he unlatched the gate, pulling it open with a slow, deliberate motion. The bear remained still for a moment, its massive frame filling the space, breath heavy in the quiet. Then with a single deep exhale, it took a step forward. The earth trembled beneath its weight as it stepped onto solid ground, muscles tensed, nostrils flaring as it took in its surroundings. For a heartbeat, it did nothing. Then it moved, slow at first, then with more certainty, its paws pressing into the damp soil as it crossed the clearing. It was free. John should have stepped back. He should have let it go without hesitation. But something kept him rooted in place, something unspoken holding him there as the bear turned. Their eyes met one final time. It was not a look of fear. It was not a look of wariness. It was something else, something older, something John could feel deep in his bones. The bear exhaled, a slow, steady sound that rumbled through the clearing, and then, without another glance, it disappeared into the trees. The silence that followed was deafening. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his hands loosening at his sides. Elaine stepped up beside him, watching the last traces of movement vanish into the dense underbrush. That was... She trailed off, shaking her head slightly, unable to find the right words. John swallowed, his throat tight, his chest hollow in a way he didn't fully understand. "Yeah," he said softly. The others were already moving, packing up the equipment, talking quietly among themselves, but John remained still, staring at the place where the bear had disappeared. It was gone. It was free. And yet somehow he knew this wasn't truly the end. He didn't believe in fate, didn't believe in signs or destiny or things beyond reason. But as he turned away, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound, the low, distant echo of a bear's huffing breath deep in the trees. And for the first time in a long, long time, John wondered if maybe, just maybe, some connections were never meant to be broken. This story is a powerful reminder that compassion knows no boundaries, even between man and beast. In a world where cruelty often goes unnoticed, one act of kindness can change everything. John could have walked away, but he chose to help, proving that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite it. The bear, despite its suffering, recognized that kindness, showing us that trust can form in the most unexpected ways. Their connection was more than just survival. It was a testament to the unspoken bond between humans and nature. This tale also highlights the devastating impact of poaching and the responsibility we have to protect the creatures who share our world. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to a greater fight for justice and preservation. If we listen, if we care, if we choose to act with empathy, we can make a difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.